My job is talking to people in Silicon Valley about what's going on and trying to figure out how the world of business in particular is changing. And this thing has bubbled up in the last couple of years, and it's been ascribed on some level to Bitcoin and payments, or Bitcoin and, I don't know, Google Wallet or something, or and now Apple Pay. But there's an enormous change, and the venture capitalists and the people who are really thinking ahead about what's going to happen in the very near future are very excited about payments. So I'm very excited to talk about this tonight with a great panel. So my name is Corey Johnson. I do this show called Bloomberg West on Bloomberg TV, and we call it Innovation, Technology, and the Future of Business. Innovation, because that word doesn't really mean anything. Technology, because that word does mean something. And the future of business is meant to suggest that the impact is large and wide, and is not just to technology companies like the dot-com bubble was, but it's to everyone who has a paycheck. And for that reason, business is important, the changes in business are important, and nothing's more important than getting paid when you're in business. So I'm stoked to have some of the leaders in this emerging digital financial payment economy joining us here, because like I said, there's not much hotter in Silicon Valley. By some measures, there are more investments going into payments, or the investments going into payments are growing faster than any other sector in all of Silicon Valley, faster than social media, faster than gaming, faster than software as a service, faster than semiconductors, faster than anything. The investments going into payments are leading the way in Silicon Valley. And I think that that's an important thing as we start to discuss this, focusing on how existing financial institutions are going to change the way they do business because of digital currencies. So I want to briefly introduce the panelists tonight who are joining us. Brian Armstrong, all the way to my left, is the CEO of, and co-founder of Coinbase. And he's also a friend of Bloomberg West because he comes on the show, so we love him anyway. But Coinbase is interesting because Coinbase is a digital wallet. It helps collect these digital currencies and let you actually use them as opposed to look at the squiggly line on the screen. Elizabeth Stark is an entrepreneur and a thought leader in the world of technology, certainly. She started startbitcoin.org, which is a group of entrepreneurs who are starting to think about what these things mean, put these digital currencies and decentralized technologies that's so interesting about things like Bitcoin, and a fellow at the Coin Center, which is a nonprofit research and advocacy group looking at these issues. And Joyce Kim in the middle here is an executive director of Stellar.org, which is a nonprofit org focused on thinking about these issues and making these things work, and making them work for everyone around the issues of financial inclusion. So it's not just about rich guys getting richer, like the hedge funds that I once worked for. What I want to start with is, I think that particularly here in the U.S., particularly in the first world, particularly among, rich white guys like Brian and I, okay, just like me, that payments work fine. And I don't really, the fact that my American Express card charges the retailer a little bit more than my Visa card, I don't really care about that. And I can pay whom I want to, and I can access money or move money the way that I think that I want to. And so why do I need, so the story of Bitcoin becomes the story of a squiggly line of a price of a thing on a screen, like the euro or gold or copper or pork bellies. So what I would like each of you is to think of and answer for me, tell me something that doesn't work or works very inefficiently. One problem that people have with money or payments that they don't know they have. And Brian, since you're my regular victim on Bloomberg West, let me ask you first.
Sure. So I think you're right. It's easy for us to say in the U.S. payments work pretty well. There's certainly cases where that's not true at all. And as you pointed out, certainly in the developing world, that's one area. Compare for a moment payments to email, right? If I want to send an email from here to Uruguay, it arrives in a few seconds, it's free, it works in every country of the world. And why is that? Because payments aren't like that. The reason why I think is that Bitcoin is actually an open network, just like email. It's not controlled by one company or country. And so it's made this fast, cheap global payment network that previously wasn't there. So I think the core of your question was, what are some of the real pain points other people hit? So, if I want to send, I'm here in the US, but if I want to send $100 from here to Australia, I'm going to end up with probably about $30 on the other side of it, and it'll probably take about 4 days. Now I can actually like fly from here to Australia faster than that money will get there, which is a very odd thing because we're just transferring some bits from here to there. It should be faster and cheaper. So that's one example. There's billions of people in the developing world who don't have any financial services whatsoever, but they now have a cell phone. There's also lots of people living in countries that have very volatile currencies. So those are all some examples of some of the pain points, although there's many more, which I'm sure the other panelists will describe in great detail.
Let me ask you next, Elizabeth.
So I'd actually like to pose a question to the audience. How many people here have ever had their credit card number stolen or compromised and had unauthorized charges on their card?
I'm seeing 70% of the audience, if not 90.
So right now, sure, for the consumer, if I go and I pay with my credit card somewhere, there's a 3% fee approximately that the merchant pays. And there's broadly this 3% tax on many payments that are occurring here in our country. Unfortunately, though, with a system like the credit card, us geeks like to say your public key is your private key, which means that you're giving the secret every time you go and pay at a restaurant or at a gas station or otherwise to the person with whom you're paying. So as a result, it's trivial to take that number. There are forums on the internet where teenagers, I think, trade these for 50 cents a pop. And that's part of why it's so easy for people to compromise your credit card. So then, as a consumer, if I have to call up my credit card company and say, oh, there's an unauthorized charge, my card doesn't work for a while, I then have to request a new one. That's quite a hassle for those of us here in the US. Another example is recently I went to a bank and wanted to send a wire to another one of my accounts in a different bank. And as it turned out, the teller forgot to send the wire, so I had to go back the next day, and then it was going to be a weekend, so that was going to take several days more, and there was a $35 or some odd dollar fee in order to do so. And I thought, well, with Bitcoin, I could actually just have sent this amount within 10 minutes. And we still have an age in which we're relying on wire transfers and paper checks, when things could be done so much more efficiently with this new digital currency technology. And then, as I'm sure Joyce will mention, we have a scenario in which 93 million Americans right now are either unbanked or underbanked in our own country. And then 2.9 billion people around the world are unbanked and many more underbanked. So this is not just an issue that affects the global landscape, although it certainly does. It's one that affects us here at home as well. So there's a huge amount of potential for this technology to aid in giving these types of financial services to people that don't currently have them.
I want to revisit the idea of unbanked and underbanked because it's a huge thing that, again, much of America doesn't know about, much of America does know about. But let me, Joyce, talk to me about what you do and why payments are so interesting to what you do.
So,
in terms of solving a problem.
right. Well, we often do use the term unbanked and underbanked, and we should really kind of unpackage what that means in detail so people can understand what the nuances of it is. When you talk about communities that are unbanked, there's typically three types of financial services that constitute having access. One is saving and deposit. Where do you keep your money, right? And the way I like to explain to folks is if you only had cash in your cell phone, how would you save your money? And for most people, it's
If you only had cash and your cell phone,
where would you put your money? So the most common place is you hide it in your house. And for people in this audience, it's probably not particularly a common occurrence, but in the community that I grew up in, it's much more common that you don't have access to a bank account, so you put it inside books, shoe boxes, you hide it somewhere in your house, you bury it in your backyard. These are things that just happen all around the US and even more so globally. The second bucket of activities is the ability to send and receive. And for us, like Elizabeth said, we have our credit cards. But when you actually have no other way to send money, you actually have to trust somebody that you know who will likely transport it physically, sometimes on a bus, sometimes flying, to somebody else that you know in another city. How does that feel to you, the idea of handing your money in cash to somebody for them to transport it and you hope that it gets there on the other side? And then the third bucket of activities that are typically considered to be banked is actually insurance or the ability to borrow. And this is a more complicated financial service that we don't really think about as payments, but self-insuring, home insurance, student loans, these are all different kinds of complicated financial products that are typically lacking to all communities that don't have a solid digital footprint and history so that they can prove to somebody what their background is. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time and my team spends a lot of time working on is figuring out how do we use the changes that are happening in the technology stacks around us to lower the cost of all of these services to everybody in the world who's connected either to the internet or to a mobile phone.
So the reason I love this panel is because we're talking about three different problems, it sounds like. One is the VIG, all the people taking money. As you move your money from one place to the next, there are 16 different people, each reaching into your pocket, so that by the time the money gets to where you want it to go, whether it's the retailer or your friends in Australia, it's taking, someone's taking a piece of it every step along the way. The other problem I hear is that it's just too hard and too slow to do it, and the methodology isn't modern. It's not like sending an email. It's not like sending a text message. It's not like picking up the phone and making something happen. It's this process. And the third problem I hear is that is kind of a combination of those things, is that the expense and then the inefficiency leaves the most vulnerable and poorest people in our society suffering the very most from this because they don't have access even to the crummy systems that exist.
And this is the irony of the financial system. The poorer you are, the more expensive it is.
It's not just the financial system. It's every system, right? That's how systems work, right? I mean, I don't know if that's, I think it's why systems work. I'll exclude some religion. But that's how a lot of systems are supposed to work, right? Is help the, well, but to that point, like, when you're talking about the things that move financial systems is not the most people affected, but where the most money is. So, Brian, let me start with you. Do you think that changes in the way money works will focus on the way most people live, or focus on the way where the most money is?
I mean, it's a clever question. I think it's going to start off in certain areas first, where people's next best alternative is dramatically worse, not just a little bit worse. That's the places that we'll see the earliest adoption, and then eventually it'll topple into more and more areas. Because if you go to any business in the United States and you say, how much are you paying Visa every month, and how would you like to pay a tenth of it, they ask you like where to sign up. That's a good thing to have happen. But the earliest adopters of it will be people who, they're sending money abroad and they're paying 12% to do it, or they actually want to, be on the New York Times and read the rest of the article without having to subscribe for $29 a month, but they would pay 5 cents to read the rest of the article, so they would do that.
And to back up, you can't pay the New York Times 5 cents.
No, doesn't work on a credit card. Or they might live in, Kenya.
It doesn't work on a credit card because the fee of running a credit card charge is
it has a base fee of
30
cents
or 50
plus,
cents.
Right, so microtransactions don't work. They also might be in one of the 150 so countries that Kickstarter isn't in and want to do a crowdfunding project. Or they might want to raise money from people in a number of countries all over the world. Or they might be in India and want to get a loan from somebody in Germany, and they can't do that today. And so there'll be certain things where it's not somebody going across the street and Starbucks saves 2.5% on their credit card fees. It's actually enabling a new use case that wasn't possible at all before. I think that'll be the biggest impact up front.
Elizabeth Stark, we've gone at least 10 minutes without saying the word Bitcoin.
Amazing.
Is Bitcoin, well, I ruined it. I was going to say I want to keep going without saying Bitcoin. Why is digital currency the answer to this as opposed to just competing businesses with lower fees, where we have a very established global world of currency trading, of revaluation of currencies, of things that are necessary to help money move with more ease and with more confidence? Why do we need a digital currency for that? Why couldn't we have a digital dollar or a digital euro?
Well, so interestingly, those two are not mutually exclusive. Bitcoin could also be used as what I call a protocol for, say, exchanging US dollar to yen or to peso or euro. And I know you guys are doing a lot on this front as well in terms of what Stellar can do for currencies. And I'll let you chat about that. But
Joyce Kim's company, Stellar, which is looking at those things, yeah.
Well, because of the specific issue that you're raising, one of the design features of Stellar is that any currency can become a digital currency on Stellar. So the dollar, the euro, the peso, South African rand can all develop the characteristics of a digital currency, so that it's fast to move, it's microtransactions, or transactions as they're called elsewhere in the world, function just as quickly as email does. I actually do believe strongly that this movement will be led mostly by the developing world, because there it's actually not a convenience issue, it's a need issue. And what that means is that it means that governments are also going to focus on financial inclusion as not a nice to have, but a must have, because it ties into all their education and healthcare needs that are also going on within that same country. So I would be surprised if this changed the world first in Europe or America, and it didn't change the world first somewhere else.
So, for example, over a year ago, a friend of mine who lived in Argentina had told me that he had encountered several taxi drivers in Argentina that were accepting Bitcoin. And I don't know if people have followed what's been going on with the currency there, but the official rate is almost 2x what the street rate would be more expensive for people that are exchanging.
Well, much of South America. In Venezuela, I think it was officially 10x to the dollar a year ago, and on the street it was trading at 50x, and now officially it's 50x, and it's actually like 100 to 150x.
So while we're in the early days and digital currencies, such as Bitcoin, are not entirely volatile just yet, although we're seeing that improve, there's still an advantage for somebody in Argentina who can then go and exchange that for pesos and not be subject to an official rate. So as we mentioned here, these scenarios in which it's more of a need as opposed to a nice to have are going to be, in a lot of cases, the first to adopt. And as for the...
Which means that as Americans, those here and those listening, are going to be the last to know about this revolution.
But going back to your original question of
If it happens.
why does there need to be a protocol like this? Why don't the existing players just kind of fix this
Figure it
issue? It's because when you look at it's the history of economy. When there's fragmentation of a market, people will figure out a way to develop to unite the market so that greater efficiencies can be gained. And what we've seen, because of the jurisdictional divisions in payments, we have 180 currencies in the world. We have more payment systems than that. How are you going to get all these people to get along? Right? Are we going to actually create a UN of money? We can't even figure out other basic issues.
Well,
So
Goldman Sachs and Credit Suisse and the great traders around the world say we have. It's all the trading desks that make all these things exchangeable and let the changes in government and economics rebalance as currencies trade, and so that Americans can travel to Europe right now and and buy a lot of Barolo.
those desks work when
right.
they have customers that they can generate significant revenue off of, right? But when you're looking at communities that live on under $2 a day, and the amount of transactions that family does over the course of a year ends up with $5 of profit, yet it costs $40 to service that customer, why would these companies step up and service those customers?
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah,
good.
I'll
Go ahead.
just add one thing to that, which I think there's a really simple economics reason why the incumbents haven't driven down costs and made it faster and everything. And it's an economics one, which is that, if you are an incumbent in that market, your Visa, your Western Union, or Goldman Sachs, there's no market pressure pushing down those prices, and because there's a very high barrier to entry. Like if I wanted to start a company to compete with Visa, that would be incredibly expensive, right? I'd have to launch in hundreds of countries or 100 countries plus to be competitive with them. I don't know what the capital raise on that would be, but we'd have to probably raise at least $1 billion or $2 billion. And at the end of it,
Conservative.
right, we might,
Well, 'cause you'd have to be the financial guarantee of every transaction that every person does.
right.
For
And
at least
so
a day or two, which is more than $1 billion.
Yeah, but the reason why Bitcoin is going to compete with Visa is that it's not one company going up against Visa. That would be suicide. It's an open system. It's an open network where thousands of countries, thousands of entrepreneurs all over the world are going to be building these local businesses that all talk on the same network to each other. And so there's going to be, if you're in, Frankfurt or whatever, there's going to be 3 or 4 local businesses all competing, and they're all going to be able to speak to the Bitcoin network, and that's true of the entire world. It's almost like local ISPs being set up in each country around the
Internet
world.
service providers.
Or
So-
SMS was another good example of one that it went to the last mile of every corner of the world.
Yeah,
very
text
quickly.
messaging happened like that, and
Yeah.
now it's in decline because of cheaper text messaging like WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, other things
Yeah.
all over the world, Snapchat, lots of
Yeah.
messages.
Well,
being
another
exchanged.
open network, internet, happened to
Right.
replace it. But the point is, open networks win. That's the main idea.
And I also actually think that it's not open networks versus closed networks, actually, right? We should reframe it as how do we make all of these networks communicate together on an open network, right? When you look at the history of SMS or the internet, it actually wasn't about competing closed networks or competing open networks. It was the interoperability of the winner that made them the success. Like TCP/IP had competitors, and TCP/IP won because it was the most interoperable.
Well, let's talk about it. When I meet with people focused on Bitcoin and people who were there at the beginning of the internet, Mark Andreessen comes to mind, Andreessen Horowitz, inventor of one of many web browsers, but the web browser that seemed to win, the Netscape browser, until Microsoft won that battle for a little while. They look at Bitcoin and they say, this is like TCP/IP. This is like the moment when you can send bits across the world to reconfigure themselves into a web page or reconfigure themselves into an email, and we haven't seen anything like this since then.
So I actually want to challenge Joyce's assertion that it's not about open versus closed networks, because back in the day, I was on AOL. There were also proprietary networks like Prodigy and CompuServe. And a lot of my work, I used to teach about these issues at universities, focuses on the issue of control versus openness. And part of why these networks didn't win out, I mean, yes, AOL exists today, but it's a media company, was because of the openness of the internet. It wasn't just one entity that controlled it. It was an interconnected
Wild West.
network. Well, that too. And that was what was so powerful, and why, okay, everybody could sign up for AOL, and theoretically we'd have a network in which, you know, people could communicate, but that wouldn't be interoperable with other networks. So definitely agree on the interoperability.
The closed networks, though, still exist. It's just that they now rely upon TCP/IP also to connect it with each other, and that's the core point.
As opposed to one that didn't interact with it at all.
A closed network will never win the world, but an interoperable open network is required to connect closed networks.
So Facebook Messenger you can communicate with your friends on Facebook, but it does require TCP/IP or having that anyone can join that
and
network because it's
HTTP
open.
and all of the internet protocols that are open. Yeah. And with regard to the issue around Bitcoin being the early internet, part of why I got interested in it and was so excited about it was that I saw the potential not only for this decentralized open source currency and financial protocol, but also for a new form of technology that could be built upon for not just currency. In fact, a lot of people don't know this, but Bitcoin's potential goes beyond just money and payments and finance and so on. There are potential applications that could relate to everything from law and what are called smart contracts to eliminating fraud. I just saw a company the other day that was is using pharmaceuticals actually and the blockchain, which I can get to in a second and explain the underlying technology, to eliminate fraud so that you can verify if your drugs are real or fake, which is a major issue elsewhere and around the world.
All right, so I didn't have to bring up the word. I did have to bring up the word Bitcoin. I did not have to bring up the word blockchain.
Sorry, I just
I
went there.
think blockchain is like that. That's what disproves the notion that Bitcoin's a price, because blockchain is a technology and a trippy one. I met with someone the other day who was trying to use Bitcoin to eliminate wine fraud, so that you will have the provenance of every transaction that happens just by the payment. So the minute you put your payment to the payment register or whatever, you'll see, as soon as the price crosses, you'll see every transaction that took place for this item on this currency. And so without getting too lost in blockchain, I don't know, Joyce, do you want to explain what blockchain is?
Well, actually, these two would actually be better at blockchain because we are.
That's why I asked you.
So then what do we consider blockchain to be?
I want to avoid like the phrases in the industry because it gets people lost.
Right. So one of the core concepts of Bitcoin is that it's built upon a proof of work algorithm where people bring together a lot of computing power to figure out essentially a very tough problem, and it becomes a way to know that there's agreement around transactions without there being a central authority as to be the final arbiter of this decision.
I paid you, and you know my money's good.
Yes, and it avoids this problem which you're talking about here, the double spend problem. How do we make sure that the dollar I give you is not a dollar that I give to Brian in a digital form?
Right, because if I walk into the coffee shop and I give them my dollar, they know it's a US dollar. If I give them my Visa card, they run the card and see if it's good. And if I say I'm good for it, they say, who are you?
Right. Well, so here's the really exciting part about Bitcoin is that it was really the first time when we look at the digital space, look at all the other digitals we have, MP3s. If I gave you an MP3 5 years ago, and I told you, Corey, this is the only copy of the MP3, how would you ever know that it was the only copy? You would not know. And that has limited our ability to transact online for quite a while. And Bitcoin really took that problem and blew it to pieces and said, hey, now we have a way to transact in a digital, decentralized manner where we know every piece of value that we're transmitting is authentic. And what this technology allows us to do is think about many, many new ways that we can bring economic transactions that have been trapped in the analog world into the digital world.
But I think what you're not talking about is the way that the digital currency doesn't just validate against fraud, but also measures its history or records the history of the transactions. And Brian, you're nodding over there. Like the history of the transaction, I have a mortgage. I've had a few over the years, and there's a lot of paperwork to sign, including the title and the history of the title and what the property's been, where the property lines were and who owned it and who said that this is exactly what the property is and this is where the fence lies and this is the guy that owned the ranch that is in the middle of Manhattan, you know.
Getting back to your old rich white guy, I didn't know you had a ranch in Manhattan. I'm going to have to look that up.
I do. It's called, and I will also sell you the Brooklyn Bridge for only a few Bitcoins.
Great. But yes, to your point, the blockchain is great at that. I think your example was a great one about MP3s. It's so easy to make copies of anything digital. The blockchain says you only get to spend this once. And that was a computer science breakthrough that had never been possible before. Someone published a research paper on it, Satoshi Nakamoto. Nobody knows who it was, which is an incredible story as well. They published it anonymously.
They? He?
He, she,
We
they.
don't know.
We don't know.
He's a mystery, but he created this thing.
Yeah, it was a brilliant invention that is going to change finance. So it's pretty great.
Wait, so go on. So the blockchain does what? I mentioned mortgage. Like, what are the kinds of things the blockchain can? I mentioned wine fraud.
Yeah, so you can transfer any kind of digital asset on the blockchain. So that could be real estate. It could be a concert ticket. It could be a title to a car. It could be, some kind of equity or shares of a company.
A title to a car. So I buy a used Camaro.
Yeah.
I pay for it with Bitcoin. If the city or state, whatever the DMV state accepts that as title, they know unimpeachably that this title came from this person and it refers to that exact car.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you could embed that in the current Bitcoin blockchain. There's also people are working on side chains. There's all sorts of things that might specialize in like real estate or cars or something like that. It might have additional metadata attached to it, like for a piece of property, it might have a lat longitude or a survey data or something like that attached to it. So, previously every country kind of had to keep these central records of paper records traditionally that are slowly getting digitized. But wouldn't it be great if we could put that all in a global ledger? And it would cut down on some of the fees, like especially in the case of shares of a company, transferring those around. There's an untold, amount of legal fees out there in companies disputing this. And why couldn't I just transfer me to you almost like a dollar bill? And we eliminate any of the third parties in the middle and save us all a bunch of legal fees. That'd be pretty cool.
And part of what's so interesting about this is you have this distributed authenticity, as Joyce so eloquently described, and it doesn't even need to be financial in nature. I don't have to pay with Bitcoin to use this technology. For example, I met with a startup the other day that's meeting with a state in the US where they have a huge amount of property fraud, and they can just use the blockchain or this distributed ledger to reference property title, even if you're not paying in Bitcoin. So there's a really interesting future trajectory here where we can keep track of things and make sure that they're authentic in a distributed way, so there's not one entity controlling it. That could affect commerce, marketplaces, digital identity, even voting.
So good fences make good neighbors. Maybe good Bitcoin makes good neighbors too. But Joyce, does good Bitcoin make for a good society? I alluded to this earlier that innovations in money, innovations in finance tend to be geared towards and even help enrich the people who have money already. But as we've discussed a little bit, the greatest possibilities are for people with the least amounts of money.
Right. So that's actually I actually really like this question. And the reason why is that...
That's my job.
Good job with this one. When we look at how people build products, what we've seen here in Silicon Valley is that Silicon Valley has become really good at building products that grow really fast for everybody that's on the latest iPhone, right? And those of us that have access to this closed loop system do a really good job of winning in this closed loop system. The interesting thing about Bitcoin and all the digital currency protocols is it really has allowed people all around the world, wherever they sit, to look at these protocols and say, hey, I could actually build something that works in my environment. And fintech is really interesting. Financial technology is interesting because there are these jurisdictional walls between countries. And when you look at how people interact with financial tools, the average person uses like 10 to 15 financial products. It's not just one. So we actually need a huge diversity of financial services. What these open protocols allow is for local developers, local companies, in every country in the world to start experimenting and have access to a system that they otherwise would not have been able to plug into. Case in point is that we're working with a software company that works primarily in Nigeria, and they do core banking solutions for microfinance organizations. So microfinance organizations.
Unpack what that means for me.
A microfinance organization, they give software to these quasi banks, right? Microfinance organizations give loans, small loans,
Right.
to people that want them for either living expenses or to start a business or whatnot.
And their
These
return on capital tends to be awesome.
It
And
varies.
they're-
It does vary.
Yeah.
But these microfinance organizations have no SWIFT between them, no ACH, to allow them to transact between microfinance organization to microfinance organization. So we're talking about hundreds of millions of people that are essentially banked, in quotes, because they do have access to a lending capital, yet they can't send money from one branch to another. And some of the microfinance organizations I've spoken to tell me they use Western Union to send money from one customer to another internally, right? And what this small software company,
Western Union taking a
cut along the way.
a cut of like
Right.
So actually, the World
5,
Bank
10,
reported
20,
that
30%, yeah.
the average remittance fee, and this is the kind of similar thing, is 8%, and it can be up to 3 times as high. So it could be up to 24% of I'm sending, $20, and then 24% of that
Right.
is going to Western Union.
So then now small companies like this company here can start experimenting and say, hey, can we use these digital currency protocols to connect these microfinance organizations? And that's exactly what they're doing with Stella. They're now making it very easy to send money from Lagos to the north, which otherwise would have been a 12-hour bus ride, and now they can do it digitally. And they can do it in local currency so that there's no pricing confusion for their customers.
So let's talk about security and as it relates to Bitcoin. We've seen it seems, the white paper on Bitcoin suggests security shouldn't be a big problem. We've seen a lot of Bitcoins just disappear, and we've seen some sort of resulting volatility about the collapse of Mt. Gox in particular. You're smiling like I'm a moron, which I am, Elizabeth Stark. But when you look at these security issues about I lost my phone, where's my Bitcoin? Is that a risk?
I think it's actually a big risk.
What do you think?
Right. So one of the things about Bitcoin that is different is that it is irreversible. So for example, there are stories where I have friends who had thousands of Bitcoin on a hard drive back when it was worth, pennies, and they just thought, it wouldn't ever be worth anything, and they threw it out, and they can't recover that. Or in certain cases where there have been, Bitstamp was a major Bitcoin exchange where there was I think something like $5 million stolen from what's called their hot wallet, which is their readily accessible funds. And once they're gone, and this is scary. So one of the things that we're seeing now is this emerging insurance industry. There are several players in the space that have gotten insurance policies where if one's Bitcoin is compromised in this way, you can still recover it and get it back. I do believe we'll see on top of the Bitcoin system means to, say, dispute a charge or have a reversal. I don't know if you guys are working on anything related to that. But the irreversibility of it both causes some downsides, and there are advantages too. For example, it's a lot harder to have fraud, unlike if I have a stolen credit card and then I go try to buy a computer. Well, with Bitcoin, that's not really possible.
Yeah,
Brian?
so this is an issue that we think intimately about as the company storing more Bitcoin than anyone else in the world right now. One of the things, like Elizabeth said, so there's Bitcoin's not reversible, right? But nowhere in the Satoshi white paper does it say Bitcoin will solve all security problems. It says you can't create counterfeit Bitcoin. So it actually does a really great job of preventing people from counterfeiting Bitcoin. But in terms of security, all the same rules apply as with holding cash or having money at a large institution like a bank or something like that. So you probably don't go around giving your password out to your online banking or anything like that. And if you have cash, you can get robbed on the street of San Francisco, I suppose. And so what's happening is that there's a new breed or generation of companies like Coinbase that are coming up and providing these kind of secure ways for people to store and use Bitcoin. So we have 2.5 million people who have these wallets, then they're storing Bitcoin with us. We've created a number of, we're one of the holders of an insurance policy like the one that Elizabeth mentioned. We also do things like we store 98% of all the Bitcoin entirely offline. And we do a distributed key storage mechanism that has it located in safe deposit boxes around the world in various locations, and you need to restore them in certain numbers and quantities to actually spend them. And We've invented some.
Wait. So
Yeah.
I want to compare this to something. So I know from friends who buy and trade gold that when they want the physical, I know some people will only trade gold if they can get physical delivery. And when they press the issue and go to the clearinghouse and say, okay, if I'm buying the rights to 1,000 ounces of gold, whatever, they find out, oh yeah, actually we don't actually have that kind of gold, and we don't really know where we get it from. Somewhere maybe. But with Bitcoin, you're doing a physical storage of what?
We're storing private keys, which is almost, you could think of it like a long password. But here's
Dropping
if you
USB
think that's
drives in
interesting.
safe deposit boxes around the world?
It's like Harry Potter when they have to pull together the 7 keys that are hidden around the world.
Yeah.
Brian, are you seriously doing that? Physical?
We're storing private keys like that
And where are they
in
kept?
vaults. If you think that's interesting,
Ask J.K.
I'll-
Rowling.
I'll tell you another more interesting topic. So there's actually a great thing you can do in Bitcoin is some people want to be able to store their own Bitcoin. They don't want to have somebody like Coinbase provide that security to them. They want absolute and full control of it themselves, but they want easy to use software tools that can show them, hey, here's my balance, my transaction history, I want to send the money. And so we, along with some other people in the Bitcoin industry, have built something called multi-signature transactions. It actually allows you to use online banking, kind of like what would be similar to online banking, but you're doing it at Coinbase. But we actually don't have any control of your money. You are the only one who has control of it. And that's something that hasn't been possible before in financial services. It's almost like returning the control of it back to individuals and businesses, like if you wanted to keep it in your own personal vault at home or something like that, but you can still have access to great financial services. Send it around the world, send it to your friend using your smartphone, etc.
What's so cool about this technology, by the way, is I could say, give a family member one key, this cryptographic line of letters and numbers. I could hold one, and then Coinbase could have one. And let's say that I lost mine. Well, that could still be recovered from the one that Coinbase is holding, and then the one that my family member's holding.
Yeah, it's almost like in the movies when they launched the nuclear missile, and like the captain and his co-captain have to put their keys in the same time and turn it. But if one of them is incapacitated, they can have they need a quorum of keys, like 2 of 3, 3 of 5, that kind of
It's
thing.
usually Schwarzenegger shot somebody who's dying and bleeding and turns it. Elizabeth, when we talk about sort of what that could mean in terms of fraud, I sort of think about issues about money laundering, and that's one of the reasons that government has used to say you can't transfer money whenever you want, and you can't transfer money anonymously. And money laundering is an enormous issue, whether we're talking about Switzerland or whether we're talking about cocaine runners. I mean, how do you address the issues of, when you're thinking about the future of this currency, how do you keep it from not, with all the possibilities it has, from being dragged down by these serious issues of money laundering and government's desire to slow that, occasional desire to slow that down?
Yeah, so this is a huge issue that a lot of people right now are trying to address in terms of the regulatory and the legal angle of this. Naturally, when money's involved, government sees that as something that they want to get involved in. So in the early days, of course, in the early days when Bitcoin was worth like a penny, nobody was seeking to regulate it. But now that we're seeing, this year we're on track to have 1.2 billion venture capital dollars invested in Bitcoin companies, this is really becoming a thing. So we've seen, for example, in the US, FinCEN, or the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, back in 2013, issued their initial guidance. They're the ones that run the money laundering here in the US. They implement the
money laundering.
The
Yes.
Bank Secrecy Act.
As
Yeah,
far
the
as we know.
regulations around money laundering. Excuse me. Yes, they implement the Bank Secrecy Act, and they issue guidance around how to comply with that. So we have already in the U.S. since 2013, we've had fairly clear guidance, although there have been some questions around what this means. So for example, if you're running an exchange for Bitcoin to US dollar, you have to comply with the regulations here in the US. We actually just saw that the UK announced their approach to this issue, where they're also going to apply these regulations to Bitcoin exchanges. But notably, in this report that they released, they mentioned that they don't see that there's a current major risk for money laundering with Bitcoin. At least they don't see that activity happening right now. I spoke to a colleague of mine who's the chief compliance officer, was ex-law enforcement and ex-bank, who's now working in the technology industry, and he told me only 1% of money laundering is really only caught. And most of this is in invoicing issues and with big banks. So it's interesting to see that there may be a risk in Bitcoin, but right now that's not really what it's being used for. So the challenge here, and part of why so many people are spending time on this, is how can we prevent these criminal uses and not have people using this technology for bad while also encouraging the kind of innovation that has led to this massive investment, that has led to all the companies that we have here today, and that will enable people to continue building and innovating. And this is something that certainly keeps me up at night, but I'm doing my best to try to strike a balance here.
Joyce, Kim, at Stellar, do you think that the prosecution and concern about money laundering is overweighing issues that can actually help people who don't have don't have really stakes in that game, but are unable to access digital currencies because of, and other currency transactions because of money laundering?
Well, actually, you'll see that in the nonprofit space, there's actually a huge desire to see some amount of traceability and trackability. So the interests actually align there. Case in point is that in a lot of kind of frontier markets, there's a significant amount of government to citizen cash transfers for rice subsidies or milk subsidies when there's a famine, and a good percentage of that money gets lost along the way. So governments are actively looking for good ways to transmit this.
Lost, but let me add maybe stolen. Let me add even with corrupt governments, they love when those subsidies roll through, or those international aid programs roll through, because they can take half of it.
And then you'll see cases. I read this great story about the police in the Afghan police when they switched to digital payroll. Some of the police officers thought they were getting a 30% pay raise because the money was going direct to them all of a sudden, right? So there are huge net positives that can come together through all of these systems collaborating.
I guess I'm just thinking of the corrupt governments around the world. You know, Fredonia. I made that up. It's a Marx Brothers reference. But you know, those corrupt governments, they like when Afghanistan. We've seen so many stories about in Kabul about money disappearing that was supposed to go out. There was a story in the New York Times a week ago about money the CIA paid to the Afghanistan government that was used that went straight to
Right.
you know.
And there'll always be good guys fighting against that, and we're going to help those guys out.
Such an optimist.
One of the really interesting things, and not everyone gets this about Bitcoin, is people think that it's anonymous, but because of the blockchain, we have this persistent record of all transactions that occurred on the Bitcoin network. So even for something like money laundering, those could be tracked down in interesting ways by analyzing the network in a way that cash, sure, you have the suitcase that would be full of cash that maybe you're bringing on a plane, but it wouldn't be that easy. So there are even some interesting advantages here.
So one of the interesting and odd things about Bitcoin is the way it's evolving as a technology, because it's open source, but the open source community looks to guidance, wants to make a change, wants to say, hey, we've got a problem, how can we fix this? Who can we decide, how can we decide as a community who should fix this such that we'll all apply it? And what I've learned is it's not that the community decides it, it's a dude named Gavin.
Not a dude. Actually, this is one of the most brilliant things about Bitcoin.
So let's talk about this.
In my view, yeah. So Gavin is kind of the benevolent dictator, if you will. He's a little bit like Linus Torvalds of Linux, if people know who that is. But Bitcoin is not ruled by a dude. It's actually
Gavin's a guy in Indiana who's not the inventor of the Bitcoin white paper, Satoshi, but
He's
has,
in Massachusetts.
is he in Mass? Sorry, I take it back. He's in Mass.
No offense to Indiana.
Much
Yeah.
love.
But the
Hoosiers.
Bitcoin protocol and how it might change over time is actually determined by a consensus of Bitcoin miners all over the world. And they're literally voting with their computing power, which is a very strange concept to think about. But if, let's say, somebody wants to overrule Gavin and they say, we think this protocol feature should be added to Bitcoin, they can create what's called a fork of Bitcoin. Or on GitHub, they have a fork as well. And if they put that out there and they convince 51% or more of all the Bitcoin miners with their computing power to use that new version of Bitcoin, that by definition is the new Bitcoin blockchain. So it has this amazing kind of mechanism built in that prevents there from being like somebody who abuses it or becomes a non-benevolent dictator. And that gives me a lot of confidence in Bitcoin's long-term survival.
In geeks we trust.
And how, as opposed to dorks and nerds, forget them.
Yeah.
I feel
So-
like geeks have kind of won somehow over dorks and nerds, but
said the woman in Silicon Valley. I couldn't agree more. I've been trying to incorporate some questions from the audience, and please, if you have more, fill out the blue cards that you have, because this is all about sharing ideas and the best questions and the best answers we can possibly find. So among the questions that's come up is a really smart one. Central governments and central banks control their economies to a large degree by the issuance of currency. You know, you could argue OPEC it's about the oil production rates that they decide. Saudi Arabia might decide a lot about economies using oil, but the rest of the world, to a large degree, is determining how their economy will work and how other economies will work with their economy on how much money they print. What happens to that world, or why would those governments ever allow digital currency to happen? Or is digital currency in opposition to what central banks do? Well, you start, Elizabeth.
So we have seen some countries, such as Russia, I believe, outlaw digital currencies or have very stringent laws against it.
Let me add to that. Which countries have been most against it? Because I feel like there's a common thread, right? China, Russia,
China's
Iran.
a little. I believe they've had issues with banks, but it's still quite operational in China. Russia has come out very strongly against it. So the way that I see it, I don't believe that my mom is going to be using Bitcoin in 20 years, or my dad for that matter. It's very possible that my mom may not know she's using Bitcoin-related technology, be it Bitcoin or Stellar, in order to send her US dollar. So I actually see that these can live together in harmony.
So Brian's Coinbase becomes so much more important because he's essentially translating cash to Bitcoin.
Sure, but I'm not the believer that we are going to adopt Bitcoin as a global currency that everybody will only use as currency. In fact, it can enable people to use a variety of different currencies around the world. So now we are seeing in Ecuador, for example, they recently announced that they are creating a digital currency. It's not decentralized, there's no mining, there's no blockchain, it's just Ecuador issuing digital, whatever the...
Bucks.
Sure. But it's interesting that we now have
Script.
governments using not exactly the same technology, but acknowledging that there's a role here for a digital version of physical cash currency. We've also seen, so for example, I know here in the US, the Fed is researching Bitcoin and is very interested in it. In the UK, in their recent report, they announced that they will devote 10 million pounds, so about $15 million, into researching the space. So we're actually seeing acknowledgement of the benefits here and the willingness to put more research into it.
Yeah, I mean, so central governments do probably enjoy that privilege and allows them to get some more control over the economy. You could argue that it might be at the expense of individuals or businesses to different degrees in different countries. So in my view, actually, that is one thing that Bitcoin will probably change in the world is it'll bring about a little bit of a shift of power away from governments back to individual consumers and business owners. I think
you said that. I mean, what you're really saying is that the strength of an economy will determine the strength of a country, as opposed to central governments being able to control that through the issuance or restriction of M2 money supply.
Sure, that's another way to say the same thing. Yeah, and I think that might be a more
if
fair
your economy
system.
Stinks, your country can't save you anymore by changing money supply rules.
That's right.
Now I do think Bitcoin
countries
leads to more. Just to be provocative, because we're
Why
on
not?
the radio, we're in front of a great crowd.
Yeah.
So what you're really saying is that if we get to a Bitcoin-driven currency globally, that we will actually have a lot more volatility with big economies that might otherwise have seen softer landings because of a smart central monetary system.
Depends if you think central banks are actually mitigating that problem around the world, which is probably an open question. I don't. That's like above my pay grade, but
I can't blame
I
you.
know that there's at least some debate on the topic. So I think this points to why Bitcoin is probably the most interesting experiment happening in economics in the world right now, because finally that experiment is going to get tried, and we'll see what happens. My view is it'll be by far a net positive for the world, but there certainly will be a lot of people whose worldview is disrupted in that process.
So, not to get too meta, but does that really mean that Bitcoin is the ultimate in capitalism? Because it takes away the role of government in controlling money supply and lessens the ability of government to control economies, and so that the capitalist systems that don't have limits, the capitalist systems that don't like labor unions, the capitalist systems that don't like price controls. The capitalist system, those are the ones that'll be the capitalist systems that figured out, hey, there's great value in slave and child labor in the short term. Like, does Bitcoin lead to the greatest exploitation of capitalism without limits? I'm going to blame the other straight white guy.
That question went about 14 different ways, which I'm not quite. We could spend the next hour maybe answering that question, but I'll just summarize and say I think Bitcoin will lead to a freer world. So we'll put it that way.
So briefly, my answer is no. A friend and colleague of mine, John Perry Barlow, in the mid-90s wrote what he called the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. And he effectively declared independence for the internet, saying, we cannot be governed. We're our own community, and all sorts of really great language that didn't really end up being the case, because as it turns out...
He also said we should answer every email, as I recall. He did. That was one of the original rules of the email. You have to answer them all.
And we're citizens of this new community, and yet there was this kind of counter movement that I taught about, spearheaded by Lawrence Lessig, who's a professor over at Harvard, where people said, no, actually, you can use law to affect the internet. And we still have these borders. Now, we can debate the merits of whether we should have the borders. But is this going to lead to child exploitation or all these negative things? Absolutely not. We still have some degree of rule of law in a variety of places. And if anything, it'll increase efficiencies, and it'll enable people to transact in such a way that you don't have, say, the 30% that was taken from the Afghan police, or massive fees in sending remittances home.
So what I think is a really important balance point here is between the Brian Armstrongs and the central banks of the world is the fact that we have to have we have to have these discussions, right? If we go back to even the beginnings of the internet, yes, the internet is more free and democratic than we ever thought it would be, especially here in the United States, although that's changing with certain things. Where my family is from in Korea, there is no free and open internet per se. We have to register our social security number with every website that you register for. And that was because these important discussions were not had at the time when the internet was regulated there, right? So I think that one of the most important things to be learned from this moment in history is the fact that Bitcoiners, other digital currency folks, financial inclusion folks, central banks, nonprofits all need to be having these discussions together to figure out this system is emerging. How do we make this work?
Joyce, where do you think Bitcoin will emerge first? Which countries? Brian's business is in a couple dozen countries. We're talking about first world, we're talking about third world. Where do you think it will emerge as, and does it need to emerge in any one place to start to achieve some sort of domino-like tipping point where Bitcoin matters and is central to the way business is done in certain places to be done in every place?
Right. I'm watching certain areas of the world very closely, like Southeast Asia and certain fast-growing countries across Africa. I mean, there needs to be a certain blend of conditions, and what they are is, high mobile phone penetration, affordability of data plans, high literacy, lack of financial services. When you have those things come together, you see things like M-Pesa, which is a mobile payment system in Kenya, come out. M-Pesa did very well in Kenya and has not necessarily won other markets as well. So we need to learn what worked there, see what can be applied in other circumstances and localized, and continue to do those types of experience. But money is fundamentally a two-player game. You don't transact with yourself. So there needs to be significant saturation in a market for these things to take off.
And one of the big challenges that we have right now is that of usability. For example, who here owns Bitcoin?
So as I look across the room, I'm seeing about 20% of the people in the room.
Pretty impressive. So right now, in order to transact in Bitcoin, if you're using what's called a standard wallet on, say, your Android or iPhone, by the way, iPhones couldn't even have Bitcoin wallets for a while, but they're back. It still can be a little complex. There are QR codes, there are long strings of letters and numbers in order to send and receive. So making this technology more usable and building products, I know you guys are also working on this, that regular people can use, and you don't have to be a crypto nerd in order to do so, will really affect how many people are able to use this. I also think you see the early adopters are almost always the tech geeks, as we had with the early internet. Maybe Brian could talk a little bit more about who they're seeing as their users, but you do tend to have people that are more technically oriented, that understand this kind of thing, that get the
But that's
mission
point,
as
right?
users.
If the greatest values to the third world, but the most iPhone 6 Pluses are in the first world, with China.
How do we bridge that gap?
How do you
That's
exactly? How do you
something
get
that
there?
we've-
How do you get there from here?
I mean, that's something that we're focusing on quite intensely. Like, we're working on a project in South Africa with another not-for-profit that has an open source messaging app. And that app was traditionally used to send healthcare information to moms as when they're pregnant so they have healthier babies. And it's used by about 10 million people in South Africa. They're launching a mobile wallet, a mobile savings account for girls, where they'll be able to save cash or airtime, which is prepaid mobile minutes.
And that's a currency, right? People
It's
use
a
it
currency.
as a currency
It's
there.
essentially a currency, and they're using Stellar because Stellar allows you to take things like airtime and make it into currency. And their focus there is how do we make it super easy for girls? Not because they necessarily want the girls to have higher savings, but because they want the girls to stay in school one more year, right? And what does a savings account have to do with keeping a girl in school for one more year? It actually provides her a sense of economic independence and self-esteem, and that is one of the biggest triggers for keeping people in school, right? So when you start seeing things like that happening, that's when you start to get out of our iPhone 6s into real-world settings that have a huge impact.
Or even the remittance issue, where there are all these services that will enable you to say, if you're a Mexican worker here in the US, you can send money home using this technology now. So that will bridge the gap between these various worlds.
So Brian, what does your customer base look like? What are the use cases? Maybe how has that changed in the last year?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. By the way, just one quick point on the last one. I got out of a meeting, a few hours ago where we had just finished translating our Android app into about 12 languages. We also make sure that our Android app works on versions of Android going back to roughly what was out there in 2007 or something like that. So
Cheaper and cheaper phones to more and more people.
yeah, there's a lot of work you can do to make mobile apps actually more viable in the developing world. Actually getting the file size down really low too, because if you're on a 2G network, you can't download a 50 megabyte app. If it's 1 megabyte, you'll see much higher usage. So we're doing a lot of things like that.
That's one of the secrets of the iPhone success in China in particular, is that the last quarter they announced huge iPhone sales and everyone said it was the 6 Plus, the most expensive phone out there. They sold a ton of their cheaper phone, swept in with that, and that means a lot more people are using smartphones at much lower price points, poorer people included.
Yep, $25 Android phones. There's 2 million activated every day. It's insane. Wow. So in terms of the user base that we're seeing, I'd say, so if you go back to 2013, a lot of the early adopters we saw were purely just buying this Bitcoin as a speculative investment. They said, something big is happening here. We want to learn what's going on and own a little piece of it because, of course, Bitcoin is provably scarce. So if you believe it's scarce and it'll be useful for something in the future, it's probably going to go up in value over the long run. But what we saw over the last, say, 2 years is that demographic has actually started to shift. So in 2014, we made a big effort. One of our company goals for 2014 was we said, we want to go out there and find 10 billion plus revenue companies in the US and get them to start accepting Bitcoin. And we actually did it. It was crazy. We signed up Dell Computers, Expedia, Overstock.com. There was a whole bunch. And
What's that the software company in Redmond?
Microsoft, they accept Bitcoin for
Right,
a
those
small
guys.
piece of it. Yep, on Xbox, I think. And so it's pretty incredible. Like the market got blown wide open in 2014. And now what's great is there's actually payment processors like Braintree, et cetera, who are
Braintree, part of PayPal, which is a part of eBay.
Yep, and Stripe is accepting Bitcoin now as well. So these are all incredible developments where people are actually seeing more mainstream adoption of Bitcoin. So as a consequence, we can look at the data of what people are doing on Coinbase, and we can see they're starting to do more online shopping. That's actually probably the next biggest thing after trading, which is still the most popular.
Trading of the currency itself, not trading other things.
What
Right.
percentage of our users are women?
We don't have good data on that. We don't ask.
You had to guess?
If I had to make it 10, 20%, something like that. Yeah. The second most popular thing is actually cross-border payments. So it's either people doing remittance like home to their family, or it's paying contractors abroad, that sort of thing. Probably the third most popular is there's like games that people are playing where there are games of skill that you get paid on in your app and you actually can win and things like that. So it's a really interesting, there's all this kind of, we're calling them Bitcoin 2.0 apps. There's all sorts of apps being developed that are using Bitcoin. It's captured the hearts and minds of developers all over the world. There's probably about 10,000 developers working on Bitcoin right now, or Bitcoin-related apps all over the world.
By comparison, I was at the Facebook F8 conference,
Yeah.
and there were 2,500 people there. So
Yeah.
those are the creme de la creme of Facebook developers, but that's 5x.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'd compare
4 or 5
the entire world of
right?
Bitcoin developers to just the one conference, but your point is taken. I think, yeah.
Imagine the crowd.
Yeah, yeah. So go back and look at Linux, in the 1980s or something, and it had 10,000 developers roughly around the world. They were really excited about it and working on it. And what happened? Every Android phone is running Linux. Every web server out there is running Linux. Even your iPhone is running a version of Linux that was derived.
Yeah.
So Linux won. We're all using MacBooks, by the way, which run Linux underneath too. So if you see a group of 10,000 developers that are deeply passionate about some technology, watch it closely, because in 10 years, it's going to be taking over. It's going to be everywhere.
And I want to work through some of the great questions from the World's Affairs Council audience here. And again, I will paraphrase, but there are a number of digital currencies out there besides Bitcoin. There's Ripple, there's, you name it, a bunch of them.
Dogecoin,
Exactly.
friendly dog.
Yes, there are some, and some amusingly named. Do those currencies, and it's probably an opinion question more than knowledge, but do those currencies stand a chance? And if so, or if not, why?
I mean, so Stellar also has a native currency in it that is meant to be the medium of exchange. The different altcoins all actually serve different functions, and there's a diversity amongst them for what each group of developers is trying to do. I think we're at that state where things are iterating and moving forward. For us to say that there is, as technologists, we should never say we've solved it, it's not going to change, right? Like, that is anti-technology. Things continue to evolve. Do we know what the future lies? No. Do we need all of these different experiments to continue to move forward so we can figure that out? Yes.
Really? All of them?
Yeah, actually, we do. I mean, that's the nature of open networks. You need a kid sitting in some learning to code program.
Well, we
in
don't need
class.
all these currencies. We don't need.
But you need the
50.
ideation around them, right? And if we don't need all these currencies, why do we have 180 currencies in the world right now?
The same reason we've got 180 software as a service startups in 2015, because we won't in 2017.
Because it makes all the survivors better.
Yeah.
So there's actually a really big debate right now internally in the community. Should it just be one blockchain and Bitcoin, or should people experiment? And I'm all for experimentation. Now, I will say there are, and this happened in the early days of the internet as well, certain people that will just launch a currency to try to make money off of it, and these are, scams, and I'm not for scam type. And they're not really innovating. The people that are doing that are not creating anything new, but we're seeing experimentation. We're seeing people use different models of, say, proof of work or other forms of proving that somebody has actually mined, or there's something called proof of stake as well. There are all these new models that are emerging, and people debate whether they're secure, whether they're not secure, but having that experimentation and the ability to launch these new projects is crucial. Now, most of them are going to fail. It's like startups, right? And that's okay, but we're seeing, I'm a supporter of more innovation, and some people would disagree. And I actually have a question. Do you guys ever plan on taking any additional currencies?
Not currently, but I want to say never. I mean, I'm an optimist. I want to see lots of experimentation and all kinds of new technology ideas happening. That being said, for right now, my personal belief is that Bitcoin's going to be the one that wins. It has, it'll probably have 95% of the adoption in the future, and I think it's too far ahead, but nobody knows for sure. So I don't want to try to claim that I know that by any stretch of the imagination.
My favorite last question as it relates to Bitcoin is always, what's the price of Bitcoin? Pick your time frame, 2 years from now. But I don't. The reason I love that question, because it sort of puts to test the "we love Bitcoin" conversation that tends to emerge from Bitcoin conversations. But I guess let me ask the question a little bit differently. What is the thing that you think would most remove the volatility around price in Bitcoin? I'm just going to go right down the line for a last question. Brian, I'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, so the number one thing is more people using it and adopting it. If you have a larger pie, any individual event will affect it less as a percentage. The other thing is that we launched a Bitcoin exchange in the U.S. It's now the largest one in the U.S., and I think we helped bring more stability to the price of Bitcoin by giving people a place in the U.S. that was regulated, that they could trust, where they can trade Bitcoin. So I hope we did our small part to help that.
Joyce, Kim?
So volatility is actually not a single factor issue. It's what do I hold and how is the world around me priced, right? If I'm holding euro and I'm living here in the US, I'm volatile, right? Like it's just not stable. So I think the question is when will people be interacting in a digital manner in the same way that their real world life is priced? And I think that will probably happen in the next 5 years in the US, 10 abroad.
Elizabeth
So
Stark?
I'm a believer that there's way too much focus on the price of Bitcoin in the media and otherwise. And what's really powerful here is that of the network. So interestingly, part of what makes the Bitcoin blockchain work is that the Bitcoin currency itself is an incentive for the miners that are trying to solve these math problems, and they'll get the reward, kind of win a lottery in order to do so. Yes, there has been some volatility in the past. We're seeing that stabilize. But my sense is that the value of Bitcoin itself is not as important as, say, using it as a protocol or the ability to exchange between different currencies or use the technology for reinventing law or accounting or marketplaces or all the other possibilities that are going to come out of that. I see that as a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity. And the price of Bitcoin, may go up, but we shouldn't solely focus on that. And as a colleague of mine said, the early internet didn't have a ticker. So we should view this as another version of the internet where the ticker isn't as important as we think it is.
Elizabeth Stark, thank you, of startbitcoin.org. Joyce Kim of stellar.org, and Brian Armstrong, CEO and co-founder of Coinbase. I want to thank you all very much. I want to thank the World Affairs Council. This is a great conversation and a lot of fun to have with you guys, so I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.